So as we move forward through a program, I want to introduce what is the first of our 3 featured technology futurists. So last year, we introduced the idea of a technology futurist to really describe modern visionaries who have a depth and breadth to critically examine technology trends and identify alternatives and powerful applications to their use. So I'm going to now introduce our first technology futurist, Dr. Karrie Shogren, one of really the most prolific young leaders in our field of intellectual and developmental disabilities with over 100 peer-reviewed articles and several books. Dr. Shogren is a professor and senior scientist at the University of Kansas, where she directs the Kansas University Center on Developmental Disabilities. Her research focuses on assessment and intervention to promote self-determination across the lifespan for people with disabilities. A fellow student of Dr. Waymeyer at the University of Kansas, Dr. Shogren is advancing the theory of self-determination through her research and practice and her studies, and using technology to do so. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shogren.
Morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here today, although as another on kind of John's comments of not necessarily a person that considers myself an expert in technology, I'm very interested to be here and to have the chance to talk with all of you. When I first talked with Shay a little bit about a new project that we have funded, we're developing a new app that's tentatively called the Goal Setting Challenge app that I'll talk to you a little bit more about today. I was sharing some about this with Shay, hoping that maybe we could talk and kind of leverage some of the technology expertise that was present. You know, Shay suggested that maybe I could come to Coleman and do a breakout session and talk a little bit and get some feedback there. That changed a little bit over time, and all of a sudden it was, well, can you be a technology futurist? Which is why I'm standing up here today. But I have to admit that when I told my research group on Monday where I was coming this week and that my title in the program was going to be Technology Futurist, they laughed. Because I'm the person in our group who, if we have to do video conferencing, someone else has to handle all of that. I still sometimes shake my cell phone when it doesn't do what I want it to do because I assume that's going to somehow rattle something around and make it a little bit better. But technology is critical to supporting people with disabilities, and in the work that I do around promoting and enhancing self-determination, we really have an opportunity, I think, at this point in time, to really think critically about where technology fits into that process about thinking what self-determination is. So we're doing a number of different projects, really looking at different ways that we can assess and intervene to enable people across the lifespan to really think about what self-determination means in their lives and how we can leverage the appropriate supports. Technology being one of those supports that we really want to make sure is integrated into that process, but that issues and considerations of self-determination are at the center in all of that thinking and in all of those decisions, and being clear on what it is when we're talking about self-determination. Obviously, self-determination is something that in the disability field is really becoming a term that's more and more common and understood by almost everyone in the area. I remember when I first started doing presentations on self-determination, and I would ask audiences, how many people are familiar with the term self-determination? You get a smattering, but not everyone. That very rarely happens anymore. People are generally familiar with the term. Although I will say that increasingly we're doing a study that I'm very excited about right now where we're working in inclusive general education classrooms, training general education and special education teachers together to promote self-determination. When I ask this question of audiences that are inclusive of both general and special education teachers, as you might guess, the special education teachers raise their hands. They're familiar with self-determination. The general education teachers, not as much. They may be familiar with some of the aspects that we're thinking about and talking about in promoting self-determination, but they're not yet familiar with that concept, which, as you can imagine, creates a barrier to working together in a comprehensive way across these systems. And I think that characterizes all the systems that we work across for really thinking about self-determination. But in thinking about self-determination and its use in the disability field, clearly going back to, and we've already mentioned the Declaration on the Rights of People with Cognitive Disabilities to Technology and Information Access a couple of times this morning, but I pulled out one of the specific bullets of that specifically notes the importance of both access to comprehensible information and usable communication technologies to promote self-determination and to engage meaningfully in all life activities. So clearly there's a focus here that this issue of accessibility and usability of technologies can be a way to leverage and enhance self-determination and promote these outcomes. But what really are we talking about here when we're talking about promoting self-determination? What does that look like? I'm going to show and talk a little bit about an example that, as you can tell from the date on the top of this, is actually a little bit of an older example, but I use this quite a lot to talk about the intersection between self-determination and technology. This is actually a very old picture of a young man, Jake. Jake actually was participating with us when he was older and in high school in some of our randomized control trials of an intervention to promote self-determination, the self-determined learning model that I'll tell you a little bit more about as I talk this morning. But Jake, when he was younger in elementary school around this time, was having some pretty significant problems in school. He was being labeled by some of his teachers as having some behaviors and other issues that were causing disruption in the classroom. He was not necessarily engaging a lot in his classes, getting a lot of benefit from them. And so his teachers actually got really excited during this school year because there was going to be a keyboarding class that he was going to participate in. And Jake generally liked some of the early technologies that were available at this time, back in the late 90s. So they really thought that he was going to go to this class, this technology was going to provide that access point for him. It was really going to influence and change his behavior. There were some assumptions being made there that we wanted to engage Jake with something that was of interest and a preference for him and support that, but it was really assumed that that technology was going to drive that process. So Jake got into this class, and this date, you'll see it's from February. So Jake had been in the class in that semester for about a month, had been continuing to have these behavioral meltdowns, the problems, not engaging. The technology did not seem to be the solution or the fix for him. Until one day, someone came in the class. The activity that the kids were doing in the class was repeatedly writing words that were part of their vocabulary words or other activities. You see the words cat, dog, fish up here. So the expectation was on different weeks that students would write cat, dog, fish, cake, cookie, whatever. They would do that over and over to be practicing those typing skills. Now, how many of you would be really excited about writing the same word over and over? Does that sound like an interesting and engaging activity? Maybe important for some reason, but there's probably different ways to do that. So a new behavior support specialist came in the class and said, well, let's just let Jake do what he wants to do with the technology today. He clearly likes working with the keyboard and being on that. Let's just see what happens. Let's let him direct his learning. Let's let him be involved in the process. So this is actually a picture of what occurred during that day. Jake wrote cat, dog, fish, as he was required to do. Those were the words that were expected to be written. And then you see this other text under here. Once upon a time in a faraway land, a young prince lived in a shiny castle. He transformed the enchantress into a beast. Does anyone know what this is from? Beauty and the Beast. So Jake happened to really like Disney movies at this time, and this is a quote from the movies that he was writing. Now, a couple of things. The teachers had no idea that Jake could type this much information, put those sentences together. You see some errors in there, some areas you could identify to work on, but really there had been no idea that this was something that Jake could do. And look at the power, both of the technology. He probably wouldn't have been able to do this in writing by hand, but with the technology, he was able to express himself, express his interests and his preferences. But the technology was interacting with those other elements of his interests and preferences and allowing that to be something that was driving what he was doing. And to me, this really epitomizes self-determination. Jake was expressing himself, what he was interested in, what he wanted to be doing with his life, which really aligns with how we talk about and define self-determination. We talk about being self-determined means acting or causing things to happen in your life. So it is being an agent over your own life. Jake was expressing his interests, preferences, what he wanted to be doing in that class. Now, we want to be supporting the development of other behaviors other than having a meltdown in class if you're trying to communicate that you want to be doing something different. But sometimes that's the communication, that vehicle that works in that situation. So being self-determined really is about being able to act or cause things to happen. Also, increasingly, we're talking much more about how this links to acting or causing things to happen as you're setting and working towards goals. The centrality of acting in service towards goals that you want to achieve in your life and making those direct connections between what you're doing, what you're being asked to do, and what outcome that leads to for you. We know from longstanding research across people with and without disabilities that when people set goals for themselves, they're more motivated, they're more engaged in the process of achieving those goals versus when those goals are set for them by someone else. Now, what we need to really make sure that we're doing is supporting people with disabilities and enabling people with disabilities to have the skills, the opportunities, and the supports to be able to express what those goals are and to be able to engage in those actions. Now, I want to highlight a few things about self-determination before I move on, because I want to clarify that a lot of times self-determination is equated to or considered equivalent to other terms we might use, like independence. But for us, and when we really think about self-determination and independence are not the same thing. Independence may be something that results from enhanced self-determination skills, from better supports, but think about what we're really talking about here with self-determination. It's acting or causing things to happen in your life. That does not necessarily mean that you have to be doing those things yourself. Technology may support and enable you to do those things. You may make a choice to have others do those things for you. I think about myself, and we could all come up with examples in your life. Every year when it's tax time, I make a choice in service to my goal of getting my taxes done, having my finances well managed, to hire an accountant that manages those things to me. I'm not self-directed, I'm not independent in that process, but I am acting or causing that to happen. I know how to gather information to identify the most appropriate person to do that. I might solicit feedback from friends and colleagues. I might look at reviews online. I might do other things to inform that. So self-determination is not the same as independence. Independence can be associated, but the goal here, the goal of promoting self-determination, is really not to promote independence per se, but it's to promote that ability to act or cause things to happen in your life and to have environments that are supportive of doing that, which technology can be a central part of that process. Also, self-determination, because if you really think about it as we're talking about it here, as having those skills, those attitudes, those beliefs, those opportunities to make or cause things to happen, self-determination is not a program. It's not an intervention. There can be interventions that support self-determination. There can be technologies that support self-determination. We even talk about things like self-determined funding and other programs along those lines. But those are all ultimately vehicles or supports that we're using to leverage to promote self-determination for the individual, for making that person be a part of that process of acting or causing things to happen in their life. So as we're thinking about this across multiple areas, whether or not it's school-based settings or support provision settings where we're doing a lot of this work, whether or not it's in remote technologies and remote monitoring or other aspects like that, or health aspects, it really is thinking about how people with disabilities are at the center of setting those goals for what they want and need in their lives, and we're matching the technologies, we're matching the other aspects to those desires and the wants and needs that they have, so that that's really what's driving the process, so that we don't get lost in creating programs without linking that directly towards the person's actions and the person's abilities to drive those processes. So So one of the ways that we attempt to do this to support people with disabilities is we've developed some interventions that actually break down and make more concrete, teaching some of these goal setting and self-regulatory skills that are involved in acting as a causal agent and being self-determined. So the SDLMI is the self-determined learning model of instruction. I just want to briefly introduce it to you here, but essentially this is an instructional model that was developed to be implemented by a trained facilitator, be that a teacher, a case manager, a family member, that really takes this process of setting a goal, developing an action plan for that goal, and then evaluating what you've learned, and uses that to drive instruction on how to break down how you set a goal. How do you identify what your interests, your preferences, your needs are? How do you link that to the things that you know now, what you might need to learn, and then set a goal related to that learning? We've used this model both in educational settings as well as in adult support settings, and really shown that this can provide a systematic framework for teaching people with disabilities some of these critical skills related to self-determination. We also have variations on this model. This is really broad, related to any type of learning goal, so you can apply this in any type of setting. We've also have variations, for example, the self-determined career design model that focuses very explicitly on applying these steps to identifying a pathway to a career and steps to get there and how to make that happen. We also have a variation, the self-determined healthy lifestyles model, that really focuses on some health-promoting activities and how to support people to set and develop action plans for those goals, because we know that kind of that follow-through and the self-regulation and the health domain is critical to achieving those outcomes, and that putting people with disabilities at the center of that process is very important. We're also working on another variation now, the self-determined supported decision-making model, to bring in some of the aspects related to supported decision-making and how we really enable people with disabilities to be driving important decisions across domains of their life. So really, we found that this intervention can be implemented by facilitators to enhance some of these outcomes. And after a number of different trials, we have found that when we intervene to promote self-determination, we see both enhanced school outcomes as well as enhanced adult outcomes. These are kind of overall findings from several different randomized trials we've done, where we've had educators or case managers be trained in these intervention approaches, and then compared what happened under those conditions versus kind of the business as usual, which is typically that educators might be setting academic learning goals or transition-related goals for students, but those are still very driven by the educators or by the development of an ISP or something along those lines. And even though people's ideas and preferences may be informing that process, there's not a systematic way to directly involve them in those activities. So at the school level, we tend to find greater academic engagement. Students are more engaged in their academic learning, as well as greater transition goal attainment, meaning making progress towards those transition goals and other activities. We also find that when young people are leaving school with higher levels of self-determination, or when adults have higher levels of self-determination, that there's greater access to post-secondary education, greater employment outcomes, including not just employment status, but also access to benefits and feeling as though there's opportunities for advancements in jobs, as well as greater community participation. And so we hypothesize that these skills related to self-determination, the self-regulatory pieces, and other aspects, are really critical to drive these changes. And these findings are really independent of other systems level changes. We obviously know that a key factor that influences employment or access to technology is the presence of policies and practices that support that. So putting these together and really thinking about where self-determination and goal-directed behavior fits into that is something that really can be critically important. Now, I mentioned technology and really this idea of where technology does fit into all of this. So obviously, self-determination, there's multiple ways to support the development of self-determination, but technology really can be something that's critical to that process across multiple levels. And one of the areas in this new project that I mentioned that we really started to think about is how can we, kind of in this current day and age, leverage technology as a means to engage people with disabilities in a greater way, and thinking about how to develop technology solutions that may benefit them, but also to provide more power to people with disabilities so that there's not as much emphasis on having to have trained facilitators always monitoring engagement with some of these self-determination skills and goal activities. So really, self-determination, when we think about promoting it, we often talk about multiple areas related to teaching skills, providing opportunities, providing supports. And technology fits into each of these areas. We can think about technology as a means to directly teach some of these skills. There's great technologies around there to promote choice making, to even go through the steps of a decision-making or problem-solving process. But it also is what really are the opportunities that we can leverage for the use of technology throughout these activities. How can we really create those environments that think about, in making decisions about what technologies you want in your life, that people with disabilities are directly engaged in that decision-making process, as well as providing the supports for fully engaging in that decision-making and in those activities. We have a couple of areas that we're really thinking about technology in relation to. One, we've been engaged in a project over the past 5 years or so to really update and try to make much more user-friendly and meaningful for people with disabilities and those that support them, the assessment tools that we have available to better understand self-determination. Our previous self-determination assessments were used for a lot of research purposes, to some degree in practice, but they were paper and pencil based, relatively unwieldy in terms of number of items and areas to do. So we've been developing the self-determination inventory, which is an online system. You can go to our website, selfdetermination.org, and see kind of the initial beta versions of it. But we've built in a lot of features to promote cognitive accessibility and usability for people with and without disabilities. It only takes about 10 minutes to complete, but the really nice thing at the end of this is people with disabilities can get a profile of where they're falling in these different skill areas that are related to self-determination that I talked about, so that that can then be used to think about building some of those instructional and teaching opportunities, building supports. It can inform service planning. It can inform transition planning and IEP development and planning. And so the idea, too, is that these scores can then be tracked over time so that we can see more and more where that change is happening. So we have both a student report version and are currently actually collecting data on an adult report version for adults with disabilities to try to find ways to make this information more accessible and meaningful in that context. Now, I also mentioned this self-determined learning model of instruction. So if you guys were paying attention and not falling asleep, you've seen this slide before. But so one of the things that I mentioned in talking about our SDLMI is that it's implemented by a trained facilitator. So it was built to be a model of instruction, meaning that teachers could use it in their instruction. Anyone providing support could use it to organize how they're really guiding those conversations about goals and action plans in other areas. But increasingly, one of the things we've found, and one of the areas of feedback that we've gotten from some of the people that have participated in some of the trials, from some of the focus groups we've done with people with disabilities and others, is that that still leads to a level of relying on the facilitator to be driving, this action planning process, the monitoring process. There are obviously technologies out there that can inform that, but they haven't necessarily been developed to really put the person with a disability in the driver's seat of kind of tracking these goals and doing some of these activities that are critically important. And that's where this new project, the Goal Setting Challenge app, came from. We've literally been funded on this project for, I guess it's about a month now. So we're in the very early stages of thinking about this and what it will look like. But what we really want to do here is to utilize, especially some of the advancements. We're focusing on adolescents for the first version of the app, although we plan to move this into potentially adult-based applications as well. But so during that transition planning period, looking at opportunities to really take the framework of the SDLMI, still having trained facilitators, still having teachers or transition support professionals that are supporting that goal process, but also really giving young people more of a way to engage, using some of the ideas behind kind of game development and kind of interactive educational apps to really kind of promote more of that. We're building in some features that it will give weekly alerts or even daily alerts depending on the types of goals that students are doing. Have you thought about this? Dependent on someone else to be prompting them to be thinking about these activities. And it can be directly linked, though, to an evidence-based instructional model that teachers can actually be using in their classrooms and during those activities. Now, in addition, though, to just the app itself, and for those of you in the room that do a lot of grant work, this is a theory of change from a grant proposal, kind of like a logic model. And my intent is not that you read everything that's up here, but I just want to kind of share how we're thinking about where people with disabilities and these adolescents with disabilities fit into the process in multiple ways, not just as end users, but also as co-designers of these activities. And really what led to this, as I mentioned, causal agency theory is the theory that we use to define self-determination and how you promote its development. The self-determined learning model, that's kind of this intervention that I've been telling you about that we've been using for long periods of time. Also bringing in some of the principles of instructional design and other aspects related to technology, but to then let that drive a development process where we directly collaborate with people with disabilities to think about what are going to be the most useful features of this. How is this going to work in your school life, in your home life, and in other areas. And then really use kind of the pilot testing and initial aspects of this to really figure out how usable and feasible this is and what information we need to give to supporters that are going to be promoting that technology use, because some of the feedback we often get from teachers as to why they don't necessarily use technology is because they don't understand how to use it. So they're not going to be supporting young people to use it. So we've got to address that issue in some of the materials that are coming forward with this. But we're then hoping that after these development activities happen, that this leads to kind of enhancements in adolescents with disabilities driving that goal-setting process, meaning that they are the ones that are identifying those goals with support from others, but also really having opportunities to learn and expand and build on the skills that they have for monitoring their own behavior. This is just a mock-up. These will likely change quite a lot over time, but of some of the pieces building on the SDLMI that we're hoping to embed, you see the graph up on the screen that really shows how students are making progress in their behaviors. We really want to add in that element of promoting kind of self-reflection, self-understanding of progress towards goals and other activities. One of the aspects of the self-determined learning model, you probably saw that phase 3 is all about adjusting your goal, figuring out if you met your objective. How many of you meet every single goal that you set for yourself? How many of you have your most interesting and kind of effective learning opportunities where maybe you don't necessarily achieve a goal that you set, but you have to go through the process of figuring out why that was? Was it that the goal was not necessarily the right goal? Did I learn that maybe I need to kind of revise that goal or think about something different? Or maybe it was my action plan that was horrible. We're always using examples when we do training of this around New Year's resolutions. It may be a really good idea to set a goal related to getting healthier or going to the gym more often to work out. But when your action plan is that you're going to do that every single day after you haven't done that for 5 years, that's not a very effective action plan. But what we have to be able to learn is to have that behavioral flexibility to figure out that when something isn't working, what is an alternative pathway to get there? How do I revise that action plan to think about something different? And really our question here is, what supports can we put in place that will prompt people? Adolescents with disabilities, adolescents generally, need a lot of support around thinking about some of these self-regulation aspects and kind of modifying their behavior and identifying new ways to think about things. So the idea is that this can provide some of that prompting, some of that guidance, some of those tips on how to do that based on the feedback that we integrate from people with disabilities, that again, teachers and other supporters are still going to be central to the process of using this app, of engaging with it, but we are not going to have young people waiting on teachers or others to encourage them to think about revising their pathway or evaluating the data. One of the things that we often run into, especially across the lifespan when supporting some self-determination skills related to this evaluation phase, is kind of this question of, well, how do we make that information meaningful and accessible so that a graph like this, whether it's a line graph, whether or not it's kind of showing different ways, so that people with disabilities really understand their own data and are able to engage with that and use that as a mechanism to understand what's happening in their lives. And there are ways to do that, and part of that is really raising that expectation. To me, it goes back to Jake in his example. No one knew that he was going to be able to write incomplete sentences until he was given the opportunity to do that. So part of this, as we often find when teachers and when case managers start using the SDLMI, we often see as much change in their perceptions of the capabilities of the people with disabilities they're supporting as we do in the people themselves. So we want this to be another mechanism and vehicle to drive that process. Sorry, there was going to be a brief shot of a teacher there that I wanted to share with you. That was actually one of the teacher and her students that drove some of our thinking of the need for an app like this. A teacher and two of her students that were using the SDLMI as part of one of the big projects that we currently have going on there over on the East Coast. But what I really just wanted to kind of highlight as a part of that interaction and what we heard both from this teacher and from the students was that, Patrick, the student she was talking about there, one of his goals for the future as he was going through the transition planning process was to become a teacher or to do something that he was directly impacting other young people with disabilities. And as he was using the SDLMI, he was really able to better refine and kind of define the actions that he was going to take to work towards that goal. But so his teacher came to us and said, well, I think that Patrick should be teaching other students how to use the SDLMI. I don't necessarily need to be the teacher of this anymore. The students could do this, but the materials aren't necessarily as accessible as they would need to be right now for Patrick to be guiding that process. So it's been conversations like this, and how can we even use these vehicles? And I think this has a lot of relevance in the instances when we're doing this to support adults with disabilities and setting goals for the supports that they're receiving and the outcomes that they want to achieve in their future, of how can we really leverage technology-based supports and other supports to truly put people with disabilities in charge of driving this process with support from others, but why can't they be the facilitators of these activities? This last slide that I'll wrap up with is a quote up here, actually, from a self-advocate as we were doing some interviews and focus groups around what self-determination meant to them, especially as we were revising and refining some of the theory that guides the work that we do. And this has always been one of my favorites, which is self-determination is being able to talk about what you want in your life and set goals and dreams for yourself. You have to go do something or you won't be nothing at all. And a few things in this quote. You have to be able to talk about what you want and need in your life. Obviously, just that piece of having the opportunities to express that, whether that's verbally, whether that's in whatever medium, being able to express those things. But then expressing that is one piece, and we do more and more and are much more supportive of that in our field. But then it is setting goals and dreams for the future that are actionable, that we can take ownership ownership of taking action and doing things to make progress towards those areas. Because as the last sentence here says, which I think is at the heart of self-determination, you have to go do something. You have to engage in these goal-directed actions, or you won't be nothing at all. What is the point of life if we are not engaged in actions that we see as linked to change and outcomes and the things that we're wanting and needing in our lives? So it's been a privilege for me to have the chance both to think through and pulling these slides together and to talk a little bit about how self-determination really is, going back to the Declaration, something that is identified as a critical outcome of technology, of all supports and services that we're providing, and something that's fundamentally important for all people, including people with disabilities. But how can we make sure that we really are thinking about self-determination for each person with a disability, and using these ideas of setting goals and being empowered to take the steps that you need to take to achieve your goals? Again, relying on supports to do that, including technology-based supports, but having that opportunity to act or cause and be part of that process of selecting those supports and really driving those activities. Because ultimately, that's what's going to lead to the enhancements in self-determination that we really want to be a critical outcome of the supports that we're providing. As I mentioned, if you want to look more at any of those assessments or information on the interventions, you're welcome to visit our website or to chat with me at any time. But thank you for the opportunity to be here.